Welcome back. For this second video, we'll be taking a tour of the introduction portion of the Core Knowledge Language Arts Teacher's Guides. Every unit has its own teacher's guide, and the introduction section contains important information you'll need to confidently teach the unit. Now, before we dive in, 3 quick reminders. First, we'll be looking at the Core Knowledge curriculum, which you can download for free from the Core Knowledge Foundation's website. And there's a video both on my blog and my YouTube channel that walks you through how to download and organize those files. Second, please be sure to download the free resources I've made available on my website, homeschoolworkplans.com. I have organization guides, unit-specific prep checklists, a daily schedule for the whole school year, supply lists, and more how-to videos, including support materials for core knowledge history and geography, which is our social studies curriculum, as well as the core knowledge science curriculum. And today I'm going to be using Unit 2, 4th grade, the Core Knowledge Teacher or Language Arts Teacher's Guide as an example, but keep in mind that all of these Language Arts Teacher's Guides for 4th grade and up are laid out in the same way. So once you've watched all these videos, you'll be in a good position to use any of these units for any of these grade levels. Now, a quick note, you'll see that the theme for this unit is geology, and hopefully you've watched the first video where I explained how every language arts unit has a theme, and the goal of these units is to not only build language arts skills, of course, but to do so in the context of learning knowledge-rich content. Now, I realize these are long videos, they are, but my goal here is to give you a very thorough tour of the curriculum. I want you to be able to wake up each school day confident that you can use this curriculum to teach your student. Okay, so let's dive in and look at the introduction section of the teacher's guide. Each time you start a new unit, I would encourage you to sit down and read this introduction section the night before, or maybe the weekend before. They really aren't very long, typically 4 or 5 pages, a chunk of which are charts you don't even have to read carefully. So it's 15 to 20 minutes tops. But the background information is really helpful for teaching the unit. So let's walk through the different sections together here. Right up at the top is a brief summary of how the unit will flow, followed by a section talking about why geology is an important topic to study. At the bottom is a section discussing the topics a student would have studied in the kindergarten through 3rd grade core knowledge curriculum that will have laid groundwork for this unit. So for example, in kindergarten, they would have had a unit on taking care of the earth. In 1st grade, there were units on astronomy and the history of the earth. And then in 2nd grade, there was a unit on cycles and nature. Now, if you're new to the core knowledge curriculum, you'll just use this list a little differently. Go ahead and read through it and just make a note if there are topics or concepts you aren't sure whether your student knows, so you can provide a bit of extra info as you go through the unit. There's also review built into the readings for this unit, so there's no need to stress if your student will need some review. It's totally fine. The next section is a chart giving an overview of how the unit will flow and what language arts topics and skills will be covered in each lesson. Now, a quick note here. You could use this chart for scheduling, but if you've downloaded that set of free resources from my website, you'll have the free daily schedule for 4th grade or whatever grade you're using, and that will have all the lessons for all the units scheduled out for you for the whole school year. However, it's still a good idea to scan through this section briefly. You'll notice that the major sections like reading, grammar, morphology, and writing are all color-coded, so at a glance, you can see which days are focused on which topics. And a hot tip, in the next video, when I walk you through an actual lesson, you'll see this same helpful color-coding scheme, and it makes it easier to find your place in the lesson. Now, if you scroll down to the bottom of the chart, you'll see 4 pausing point days scheduled for this unit. There is always a section in the back of the teacher's manual talking through how you can use those pausing point days, and I'll show you how this works later in this video. Now, if you look at that schedule chart, you'll notice the first lesson says core connections, and it's typical for the first lesson in the unit to be something like this. Essentially, it's a day for reviewing and orienting the student to the new topic. So right below the chart, the short section talks about core connections and gives a brief overview of the review that will be happening on that day. And this is things like reminding students that scientists examine the earth in different ways, including geology, archaeology, geography, and ecology. Also reviewing Earth's geography, including the 7 continents, 5 oceans, and other major geographical features. Now, don't worry too much about this. That sounds like a lot that you need to keep track of, and it's not, because in lesson 1, which is that review lesson here in the teacher's guide, When you go through that lesson, it's going to talk you through giving this lesson step by step, exactly what you have to review and how to orient your student to the topic. All right, next up we have a color change to purple. Purple is the core knowledge language arts color for reading sections. In this section of the intro, there's a summary of what the student will be reading about during the unit and points out that there is a pronunciation guide in the back of the teacher's manual. I will tell you for this geology unit, that is really helpful because many of the volcanoes and other geological features they'll be learning about are located outside of North America and Europe, and sometimes the names can be really challenging to pronounce for those of us speaking English as our primary language. I'll also note that the student activity book often has some of those same pronunciations listed at the beginning of the activity pages for that lesson too. Next up, the green section discusses the writing instruction for the unit, including an overview of the assignments. So for example, in this unit, some of the writing assignments include drafting an informational brochure or pamphlet on tsunamis, writing a wiki entry about a specific volcano, and creating a descriptive paragraph about a type of rock or item in the rock cycle. You'll also see that the assignments will be incorporating literary devices they've learned in previous units of school year, including alliteration, personification, and similes. All right, next up we have the red section, covering a summary of what they'll be learning in grammar, spelling, and morphology. Morphology is learning about the forms of words, which include things like working with common prefixes, suffixes, as well as working with word roots. And then the final yellow section is an overview of some of the resources available during this unit, including that fluency supplement I mentioned in the last video that's located in that ancillary materials folder you downloaded from the Core Knowledge website. This section also talks about the mid-unit and end-of-unit assessments that are part of this unit, and the teacher's resources I mentioned in the last video are also in the back of the teacher's guide. So up at the top there, it talks more specifically about teacher resources, and these are in the back of many but not all of the teacher's guides. This tends to be things like image cards, rubrics, editing checklists, glossaries, and pronunciation guides. Now, in the back of every teacher's manual, regardless of whether there are other resources there or not, there is always an answer key for the workbook. Okay, so when you need to correct those workbook pages for your student, you're going to look in the back of the teacher's manual for those answers. The digital components mentioned here in the teacher's guide are important images of maps, diagrams, and they are part of a folder of that folder of unit files you downloaded from the Core Knowledge website. So they're in that same folder you found this teacher's guide, student reader activity book, all that is in there, including the digital components. Okay, let me give you a quick tip here. When a lesson calls for a supplemental material, it's almost always going to be either in the teacher's resources in the back of the teacher's guide or in that digital components file with the other unit resources. There are technically a few student resources in the back of the workbook, but almost always whatever it is the lesson is asking for is in those two locations. Okay, and then finally here, there's a brief section talking about the recommendation to have other resources available to the student, including some library books about geology. Now, sometimes these teacher's guide actually have a list of specific library books that are recommended. Unfortunately, for some reason, not all the fourth grade units have that, and this particular one does not. But generally speaking, what you would want to do if you have the ability to go to your local library and request books is maybe have put a few books on hold that are talking about geology. So you have those around, right? So you're just going to leave those laying around the house. Your student can pick them up and kind of read them at will, or you can incorporate them into your school days when you have time. This is very much an optional thing though. Okay, so that wraps up the introduction section. And like I said at the start of the video, I'd really recommend you read through this at the beginning of each unit. It will only take a few minutes, but it will get you oriented to teach the unit more confidently. Okay, so let's move on and look at the pausing point days that were part of that scheduled days for each unit. And let's start by jumping over to a copy of the daily schedule you can download from my website so you can see how that works. All right, so quick reminder. I have this free daily schedule, which not only includes the Core Knowledge Language Arts fully planned out for you, but also Core Knowledge History and Geography and Core Knowledge Science curriculums. I also include complete lesson plans for the free and downloadable MEP math curriculum, which is out of the UK. It's a high quality math curriculum. So basically, I have planned out an entire grade level and year of school for you using free curriculum. Okay. But I wanted to pause here for a second and show you how these pausing point days for the unit are scheduled right here at the end of the unit. So this is just a sample 4th grade daily schedule. This is the page for week 26. And at the beginning of this week, you can see that you'll be finishing up the language arts unit for the American Revolution. And then right after the last unit lesson on Wednesday, the pausing point days start. And so Thursday, we have pausing point day 1. And on that day, the content assessment is happening. So you see that right there, pausing point day 1, content assessment. And then the next day is pausing point day 2, and there's not a specific activity listed on the schedule. So let's tackle the pausing point days first, and then we'll tackle how the assessments work in a few minutes. Almost every unit from 4th grade and up has several days scheduled as a pausing point. For example, this unit 5 for the 4th grade, I'm using as an example here, for these videos, has 4 pausing point days scheduled. And pausing point days can be a little confusing because sometimes there are very specific activities like an assessment scheduled for a day, and sometimes they seem a little open-ended. And let's face it, when you're new to homeschooling or even just new to a curriculum, open-ended is a really stressful thing because it becomes like one more thing you have to figure out, right? So my goal for the next few minutes is to make this a lot easier. For many of these pausing point days, I have not specifically stated in the schedule what you should do, because I really do believe that you as a parent, as a homeschooling teacher, you need to have some flexibility here. And so what I'd rather do is explain to you how this works so that you can make some informed decisions about how to spend that time on the schedule. Okay, so here's how this works. At this grade level, 4th grade and up, so 4th, 5th, all the way through 8th grade, pausing point days generally come at the end of units. And typically the first pausing point day will be labeled for the content assessment. And right here you see those assessment instructions, but don't worry about those right now because we're going to walk through mid-unit and end-of-unit content assessments as well as some other assessments in just a few minutes. I want to do that as a separate section so you understand how assessments work. So let's not worry about that first pausing point day that has a content assessment scheduled. Let's focus our time right now on what to do with pausing point days that don't have anything specifically scheduled. How are you going to use those? So every unit's teacher's guide has a section in the back that talks about the pausing point days for the unit. And sometimes they're more general suggestions, and sometimes they're very specific, but each unit's suggestions will generally fall into one of a few categories. First, you can use these days to remediate any issues you found during the end of unit assessment or just to get some additional practice in. So this is always going to be your top priority for how to spend this time. So the assessment happens on the first pausing point day, and then on the following pausing point days, if needed, you can use this time to reteach any weak areas. And I want to be more specific about this. You're going to see in a few minutes that there are multiple kinds of assessments. So you're going to have, for the last lesson in a unit, you'll have an assessment that will tell you how well your student has retained language arts skills. And then on that first pausing point day, you're going to have an assessment that tells them how well they retained the knowledge they learned during the unit. So in this case, how well they learned geology. And so then you could potentially spend those next 3 pausing point days reviewing things that they clearly didn't quite learn the way you were hoping, right? So you can use those days to kind of review and reteach. So let's say you get to an assessment, you have found out that it looks like your student maybe didn't retain a few key grammar concepts. You can use those days then to review those. And these color-coded pages in the pausing point section of the teacher's guide give you suggestions for how to tackle different types of weak areas, such as reading, including fluency practice, grammar and morphology, spelling and writing. And there's also always support materials in those ancillary materials folder you downloaded from the Core Knowledge website. You probably won't need those for the most part, but they're there as well. All right, so to help with this review and potential remediation, or just even to get your students some more practice, most units include pausing point worksheets in the activity book. These are just in the back of the activity book instead of lesson number. So instead of saying like 5.2 for the activity sheet numbers, these will be marked with PP for pausing point. Whether you have your student complete some of these or all of these worksheets is completely up to you. These are for reinforcement generally, but can also be used for remediation as needed. So I put some examples up here on the screen. These are for the 4th grade geology unit we've been looking at. And you can see here we have a worksheet for practicing the root rupt, such as in the words interrupted and eruption. We also have one for practicing using commas and quotation marks, one for practicing sequencing adjectives, one for working with the suffix ly. There are actually quite a few more available. There's generally a practice sheet in the pausing point section for basically every language arts concept that was covered during the unit. So there's a lot of additional practice here if your student needs it. Next, some units include specific ideas for culminating activities. Now, you'll typically see the words culminating activities listed on the daily schedule when you download from my website when this is the case. But even if you don't see that on the schedule or you're not using my schedule, these specific culminating activities, when they're available, will always be listed in the pausing point section. Okay, so culminating activities, what are those? These tend to be things like short research projects, watching a specific movie, interviewing someone, something like that. I'm continually impressed with the suggestions in the teacher's guide for the culminating activities. These aren't busy work. They really are creative options for taking a break and doing something different and fun, but also something that was really reinforcing and enriching the learning process. So to give you some examples, let's take the example of the 4th grade unit on King Arthur and the Round Table. So at the end of that unit, in the pausing point section, there are 6 options listed, and you would typically be choosing maybe one of them for each day of the pausing point. One of the options, for example, is to watch a video on YouTube of Richard Burton singing a song in the movie Camelot about how perfect Camelot is, and then discussing why, despite all its virtues, Camelot ends with Arthur's death. Why did bad triumph over good in the end, and whether it was worth it? And remember, you would be doing this activity, having this discussion after you finished reading King Arthur and the Round Table, the book. And so you'll be in a really good position with your student to have a really in-depth discussion about these issues. So another activity for that unit suggests watching one of several movie adaptations of the King Arthur story. And these are all kid versions, so don't worry. They're rated G or PG, all like 3 or 4 of the suggestions. Other options include having the student share their favorite Round Table story, or watching a video on life in in medieval Europe, which I will tell you as a spoiler alert was miserable. So that's a good opportunity for your kids to see that up close and personal. Aren't you lucky to be born when you were? All right, so finally we get to option number 3 here. Okay, so some units include enrichment materials, and you'll see these both in the back of the student reader as well as in the back of the activity book, and they're generally marked with an E. So those pages will be E2.1, something like that. So you'll have enrichment worksheets for each of the enrichment readings. Now, when there are enrichment materials available, typically, you'll also see information about them in the teacher's resource section in the very back of the teacher's guide. But let's take a look at more specifically at this option, because this is the main option in the geology unit that we're looking at. It actually has several enrichment readings and corresponding activity pages available. And if we take a look at the table of contents here for the student reader, we can see there are 3 readings for enrichment for this unit. Now remember, you can use some of these, all of them, none of them. If you're needing to spend time on remediation, maybe none of these get used for a particular unit. If your student's doing well though with the core material, maybe you'll use one of these for each of the 3 pausing point days that we need to fill for this unit. All right, so to use these enrichment readings, just simply read them to your student and then use the corresponding activity book pages. So for example, the other day, we're finishing up geology right now. So the other day, my daughter and I were reading the rock towns of Cappadocia, and then we worked on activity page E1. Now, these enrichment readings are excellent. They typically explore something interesting and fun. So in this unit, we have the rock towns of Cappadocia, where people carved homes into the soft, tough rock, and they've made beautiful cathedrals and tunnels, and it's a working town. You can live there actually, or you can visit there and stay in a cave hotel room that's 1,700 years old. The second enrichment reading for the unit is about Mount Vesuvius. And there you learn the story about a very brave 17-year-old who documented the eruption of Vesuvius in such detail, scientists were able to gather critical information about the event almost 2,000 years later. And then the third reading talks about a deep sea mystery where scientists discovered there was hot water. I'm talking hot enough to scald your skin. And this hot water was deep in a part of the ocean. And it goes through the process that these scientists went through to discover what was causing such hot water in such a cold place. Okay, so now that you've seen some options for the pausing point days, I'd like to switch gears just for a few minutes here and talk about the assessments that are part of the Core Knowledge Language Arts curriculum. Now, I know assessments can sound a little scary, but I promise these are actually a really valuable part of the curriculum. Now, before we dive into the individual types of assessments, though, a few things to keep in mind. First, these are actually very well-written assessments. They're not busy work by any means. They are systematically gathering information on what parts of the unit or subject matter during the school year a student did or didn't retain. Second, they flow right into the curriculum. The beginning and the end of the year assessments do stretch over several days, but everything else is just another school day with a different format than a regular lesson. And finally, you don't have to worry about keeping track of these. If you download that free schedule from my website, all the assessments are scheduled in there for you throughout the school year. All right, so first up, there is a beginning of the year assessment that is scheduled for the end of the first unit. So students have some time after summer break to get reacclimated to school in general and language arts concepts specifically before they take the assessment. We don't do it on the first 3 days of school. We do it at the end of the first unit. So it's usually about 3 weeks into school. Now, typically these 3 days are scheduled for the assessment, and it really is helpful to us as parents and teachers to get a solid understanding of where they're at early on in the school year. And the instructions for this assessment are found in the back of the Unit 1 Teacher's Guide, and the worksheets for the assessment are found in the back of the Unit 1 activity book. So really easy. Okay, there's also an end of the year assessment, and this is typically scheduled for the last part of the last unit of the school year, but there are some exceptions. So for example, in 5th grade, there's this novel study that takes the last few weeks of the school year. So the assessment actually happens at the end of the second to last unit, so a couple weeks before the end of the school year. And again, it just takes place over several school days. The instructions for the end of the year assessment are also found in the back of the teacher's guide for that unit, and the assessment worksheets are found in the back of that unit's activity book. Now, you won't need to worry about how to grade or evaluate these either. All of that information is in the teacher's manual, and it's in great detail. No guesswork needed. Next up, most units have a unit assessment, and it's typically built into the last regular lesson of the unit, and the purpose is to evaluate whether the student has retained the language arts skills taught during the unit. So did they learn the grammar skills, the spelling, the morphology, the writing, that sort of thing. Now, these assessments typically start with the student reading a page or two of informational text related to the unit and then answering questions about the text. So basically reading comprehension, right? So for this geology unit, we've been looking at one of the readings for this unit assessment is entitled Earth Forces at Work in Japan. Now, one of these days, I'll do a blog post or a video on why, from a cognitive science perspective, it is so important to evaluate reading comprehension skills using content from a subject a student is familiar with rather than just some random passage. But in the meantime, know that this method of assessment is scientifically sound. You'll often see a writing prompt too as well in these assessments, as well as questions on grammar concepts, morphology, and so on. Now, the worksheets for this assessment are in the activity book and just part of the lesson's activity pages. So for example, in this geology unit we're looking at, there are 15 regular lessons in this unit. And for lesson 15, the final lesson, there are only 2 things scheduled for that lesson. One is a spelling test, and that just happens to be because you're at the end of a period where you're learning a set of spelling words. And then there's this unit assessment. So you'll find the answers for the assessment and a rubric for assessing that writing prompt portion in the unit assessment section of the teacher's manual, which is located right after that last lesson for the unit. So really easy to find. All right, finally, there are content assessments. Now, content assessments are very specifically looking at how a student is retaining the content information in the unit. So in this case, for the geology unit, these contents assessments are looking at how much information about geology the student retained. Okay, so we already did the unit assessment where they were looking at the language arts skills, and these content assessments are looking at how much did they learn about geology. So almost every unit has an end of unit content assessment. They're typically scheduled for that first pausing point day, right? We had looked at that a few minutes ago. Most units also have a mid-unit content assessment. So the content assessment documents for both the mid-unit and end of unit assessments are located at the end of the activity book. So you'll find them there. Now, how do you know when to give the mid-unit content assessment? That is actually a good question because the timing of those things moves around depending on the unit. It is not the most straightforward thing. Now, there are 2 ways, though, to know when they're supposed to happen. One is there is technically a prompt at the end of a lesson in each unit that says, give the unit content assessment to your student prior to the next lesson. But I'm going to be honest with you, I've used this curriculum for quite a long time, and I missed these prompts for a long time. They're just really easy to miss. So the other way to do this is to download that free daily schedule from my website, because I have gone through and hunted all these dates down for you and incorporated them into the schedule. So you'll always know what the right day is to give that mid-unit content assessment. So that's it for this video. And before you move on to video number 3 to learn how to work through a lesson with your student, I wanted to quickly mention a few things. First, a reminder that all core knowledge language arts teachers' guides from 4th grade and up are laid out in essentially the same way. So as much as this video seems like a lot of information, and I know it does, I assure you that once you get a feel for one of these teachers' guides, you're in a good position to navigate the other teachers' guides. All right, second, I would encourage you to spend time at the start of each new unit and make a habit of reading that introduction section. It'll really put you in a better position to teach the unit with confidence. And while you're there, take a quick look ahead at the pausing point section for the unit, and that'll give you some time to think about which of those activities you might want to use. Please be sure to download the free organization and prep documents from my website. I've done the organization and scheduling work for you. It's many, many hours of work. You shouldn't have to do that. And this will just give you an easier time getting started and working through those lessons each day. Okay, so now that you've watched the first 2 videos and you understand both how the language arts curriculum is structured, how to use the introduction section, the pausing points, the assessments, and the teacher's guide, go ahead and move on to video number 3. And you and I are going to take a very detailed tour of an example lesson so you can get a better understanding of how your school days will flow. All right, that's it for this video. I'll see you shortly in video number 3.